Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I would like to share a few tales of Zephyrhills, and I promise I will give you the varnished version. I have been researching Zephyrhills for quite a while, and I taught history at Zephyrhills High School. Actually was in the school system for about 40 years, and I learned a lot. So my husband Ernie, wave Ernie, he embellishes my story, so he'll be doing that as we go along. But it's a pleasure to be here today. I have written several books with Arcadia Publishing about local history, and it is my passion. I would invite you to attend the Zephyrhills Historical Association and the Pasco County Historical Society if you're interested in history. They have wonderful speakers, great organization, and it's a wonderful place to learn more about history, whether you're a native or an adopted Floridian. So let me get started. Can you look down Fifth Avenue for me, please? At one time, this looked like the wild, wild west, and I kid you not. We have picture after picture of Zephyrhills. They preferred oxen to horses because the sandy soil made it so difficult for walking. But I would be negligent if I didn't say that those pioneers, those wonderful pioneers, were not the first ones here. Native Americans from the Muskogee Creek tribe, it's the Muskogee Creek Nation, were here absolutely 10,000 in 10,000 BC. So we had hunters and gatherers that were here for a long time. And we have a variety of people that do collections around the area, and they find continuous artifacts and that kind of thing. Although we know this place is Zephyrhills, it was first known as Abbott and then Abbott Station. A businessman named Simon Temple arrived in 1886, and he purchased about 280 acres right in this area, and he developed the first settlement. In fact, the post office was opened in 1896. The voting district was established in 1893. My friend Adam Porter was trying to figure out with the Zephyrhills News what was the oldest business in town. I think we established it may have been the Colonist, which became the Zephyrhills News, but in truth, the post office and a variety of businesses existed well before that, but none were continuous during that time. Why did he name it Abbott? Well, there was a Confederate doctor named Joseph Abbott. He was an industrious doctor during the Civil War, saved a lot of lives, and was an ambitious surgeon. And he was a good friend of Simon Temple, so Simon convinced him to come here. In truth, Joseph Abbott was in Texas. He just mustered out of the Confederacy, and he weighed 98 pounds, which may not be so awful, except he was 6'2". So they really didn't expect him to live. But Simon Temple said, come to this area, you will convalesce in this beautiful climate, and you will recover. And guess what he did? He owned an apothecary and practiced his medicine at the intersection of 301 and 54. And he also was involved in lumber, one of our topics for the day. I wanted to mention that we were not Pasco County at that time. We were part of Hernando County. Actually, we were part of Hillsborough County for a while before that. But we became Pasco County in 1887. Why is that? Because if you were driving a donkey or a oxen, you had to go all the way to dang Brooksville to get a marriage license. Maybe that explains why some people didn't have marriage license. But anyhow, if you wanted to get homestead, if you wanted to, before that it was the Armed Occupation Act to get 160 acres of land. It was a wonderful place to homestead through either of these avenues, but you had to go all the way to Brooksville. So about 1887, they had a big squabble. They were going to name the county Banner County, but they ended up naming it Pasco County for Samuel Pasco. My Dade City friends could tell you about the fight that concurred with that. The next really significant date relates to this beautiful house, and that was 1909. There was a captain in the Union Army. He was born in Pennsylvania, but he came here, and actually some of the documentation says he came in 1904, but we know he was here in 1909. I want to mention that he brought his wife, Helen Marr Jeffries, who was by his side every inch of the way, and his son-in-law, Raymond Moore, who was a colonel in the Union Army, and his daughter, Sylvia. He had another son who was a doctor who never really came here, but they were all very involved. He established the Zephyrhills Colony Company for 5 acres. 5 acres you could buy for $50. What a deal, huh? We'd all go right out and get it. Actually, I should have mentioned that it was that Simon Temple bought his 280 acres for $1,000 at that time. But anyhow, Jeffries was very interested. He was real involved in a special interest group called the Grand Army of the Republic. It was like, and I hesitate to say this, but it was like the NRA today. It had enormous power in the country. And they had the GAR annual conventions here for many years. But he recruited retired soldiers from Michigan, Texas. I even saw where he recruited some from Alaska. Of course, it wasn't a state at that time. But all over the country. Used to be, guys, when I taught history at Zephyrhills High, I would tell the kids, I would go, this was a Union colony. And they go, no, Miss Wise, you're in the heart of the Confederacy. What are you talking about? Well, I usually had to produce my documentation on that. Well, Jeffries was here for quite some time. He built this house in 1911, I believe, and it was a 4-room house. And isn't it wonderful? Thank you, Mayor. Isn't it wonderful that Zephyrhills has preserved this site? You can go in and see it. You can really get a feel of architecture in the time. He built it himself. At the time, let me tell you a little bit about the time. Again, it was the rugged frontier here, and they had open range. There were 3 gates on the city, so you fenced in your property to keep the cattle and the hogs out. That's how it was done. It was actually until the late 40s, actually some people said 1951, before open range was gone here. I bet Harriet they used to tell me that you were on the school bus and you would see a dead carcass on the road because a lot of the area was not fenced in. So that was really significant. I brought along my cracker whip. Now, the origin of cracker, you heard that term before? There was a time when it may have had a more of a derogatory connotation, but not so much today. It actually came from southern England, and it's a Celtic term for the southern Englanders who came here, the Scottish, a lot of them that settled in the south. But it really talks about like a tenacious, got to put this hat back on because the pioneer women wore hats. It was a tenacious, independent lifestyle, basically. So we know that the cracker whips, and I believe Clarence Hale, I call him Cooter Hale, who was the foreman at the K-Bar Ranch here in Zephyrhills for years and years, and his dad was the foreman before that. His mother was a fantastic cowgirl, but he makes them. He's won national competitions. This is an old-time one that's actually made out of rawhide. When I was doing my research, particularly on Wesley Chapel, we must have had 50 people that demonstrated how to do a cracker whip, didn't we, Ernie? And so finally, when I met up with Cooter Hale, I said to Cooter, because I can't do it, I said, it's got to be like a golf club. It's the wrist, right? I think I talked to Anna Jo about this too. But it's the wrist. And he said, yeah. And he showed me another demonstration of it, which was superb. One other thing that was talking about open range, because everybody was really agriculturally based at that time. The cattle, the cracker cattle, were a small kind of cattle, very different than what we think of as beef cattle today. And the cracker ponies were a small kind of pony that were real agile. Let me mention about railroads real quickly. Two different railroads came through this area, and one came during the Temple period, the Simon Temple period in 1896, and that was the Seaboard Airline Railroad, and the other one was the Atlantic Coastline. I think I have to give up. The railroad really opened up the markets in the area, and it changed a lot of the complexion of the whole area of Pasco County. I wanted to mention, because I don't think anybody is going to be talking about this, but about 1910, one of the community aspects of this area really came about, and that was when the tin can tourists arrived. They started camping around Zephyr Lake about 1910. One of my friends who I taught with for a long time, Lynn Timmons, told me about her father coming here in the 1900s and camping at Zephyr Lake. And she wrote this beautiful story about how it was such a friendly place, and somebody came and delivered a load of oranges for the campers. Now, where did that tin can tourist name come from? Because obviously, looking around Zephyrhills, we know we have a lot of seasonal people, obviously tin can tourists. We don't know for sure if it came from the trailers that they were pulling, which originally were wooden but later on became metal of different kinds. We also know about that time tin cans were being used for canning. You actually had a tinsmith that made the cans. And thirdly, the third theory about this is a lot of the campers traded the tin cans. If you had a tin can of peaches, you traded it for a tin can of green beans or whatever. But the organization is still in effect, and for some reason, there were tin can tourists in Dade City, a lot in Plant City, and so forth. But in Zephyrhills, it seemed to really take root, and that's one of the things that's an origin of the area. Greer's Mill, the theme is lumber and moonshine, which I'm going to tell you about a little bit in a minute, and turpentine. But I want to mention that Greer's Mill was the first really big sawmill in the area, and it operated until I think about 1920. But it was really significant. Captain Jeffries bought most of his wood, his lumber, cypress, and pine from that area. These were vast pine trees. If you see pictures from the archives and the memory site in Florida and other places, you'll see that they look like the redwood trees. It was an enormous area. The area out in Wesley Chapel was owned by the Rockefellers. A lot of the land that's now the Porter land was owned by the Rockefellers in a trust, and a couple of other really big businessmen you would know. From the lumber, we have turpentine. And in Greer's Mill, they had a turpentine still right in that area. There were turpentine stills in various places. My favorite story is the one that is the self-sufficient turpentine community that was on the Reuben Barnes Ranch. Of course, Reuben Barnes didn't own the ranch then, but it was out on West 54. And it was a completely self-contained area. It was an African-American community, and they had their own currency and so forth. And many of the ancestors from the Barnes family, the Brown family, are buried out there. But there's a cemetery, and there are lots of artifacts and so on. So hard lifestyle. Also, African Americans were pretty significant in the building of the railroads through this area. I wanted to mention that across the street you would see Newcombs drugstore. It was built, it opened, let's see, I think about 1921. And there was this industrious, wonderful woman named Lorena May Leatherman Newcomb. And that restaurant drugstore was in operation until 2001. It was the home of the famous scratch game. Anybody ever heard of that? I know a couple people have. Steve has heard of it. And the mayor has not heard of it? This is not good. The scratch game was a game that they played there every single morning, and all of the men, and Ernie could probably tell us more about how that was done, but all of the men bid on who was going to pay for the coffee. And they were famous for this. There were several articles in the paper about the time they closed on that. But the Newcombs drugstore was an iconic place in Zephyrhills. This building right over here, which is the Women's Club, it was known by a couple of other things, was founded in 1915. I love this building because it was built in 1941, well after the organization was in effect, but it was built from the Works Progress Administration from Franklin Roosevelt. If you go out to Hillsborough State Park, there are some other classic limestone buildings like this, and you'll see them. And it's just magnificent that they're there. There's also one remaining in Dade City, which was a marketplace, and it's kind of near Cox Elementary, if anybody knows that area. I wanted to mention about the airport. Later on today, I understand there's a skydive demonstration, and there will be bands playing and so on. But the original airport was near Winter's trailer park by Zephyr Lake, and they had their first airmail postage in 1938. It was for $5. I think it was airmail from Lakeland, so it wasn't really far away. But this is one of my favorite periods of time in Zephyrhills. Lots of things went on for the development, including J.P. Porter's land, where the airport is now. But what is really significant in our history is that this became an Army airfield by 1941. And I've been told by so many people as I've talked about history that you used to see soldiers all over this area. It was a military town, and they were training folks to fly the brand new Mustangs and Marauders. There were many crashes that occurred around here because they were moving so fast to keep us up in World War II. But they were doing advanced fighting training at the airport. So that is a fabulous heritage of our area. I wanted to kind of end today by reading you two little stories. As I have done history over the last, really my entire life, I encounter people that kind of become like family to me. And the first one is really a continuation of the cracker. Both of these are kind of continuations of the cracker theme. But the first one was written by Bill Smith, who I came to absolutely adore. He spent hours and hours with me, even drew maps of the area, spent a lot of time in Zephyrhills. He told me about the time he was in the theater, right here, the Zephyrhills Theater that was built by I.A. Cruzen, and he came out and he saw everybody looking somber, and he went over to his dad, Luther Smith, and he said, "What's going on?" And he said, "They just bombed Pearl Harbor." And to hear him talk about that was so unbelievable. Later on, he joined the military, and his group was the first one to be in Nagasaki after the troops could get in after the atomic bomb. So I spent so much time with him. He wrote his life story, and I'm going to read you a couple paragraphs about this. Bill died in August of 2017, and I attended his memorial service. And at that service at Lake Javito, when we were sitting and dining and telling these great old cracker stories, his stepson, Dr. Christopher Emmer, who is a physicist, said, "I want to tell you how I first met Bill Smith." He was 10 years old, and it was in the time of Harrison Ford and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And Bill, understanding kids, he didn't have any natural children of his own, he had some stepchildren, but he told him a lot of stories about open range and probably even a little bit about moonshining, but he finally got to the point where he pulled out his cracker whip. And Dr. Emmer said, with the precision of Harrison Ford, he took out that whip, he flicked it, like I said, with the proper wrist movement, and he aimed it toward an aluminum Coke can on the post. And he said he made 4 whips of that, and he took out COKE, all 4 letters of the Coke can. And he said from that day on, he was my own Indiana Jones. So with that in mind, a frontier man, let me tell you about from Bill in his own words. He wrote this in 2004. I was born in 1925, the son of Luther Smith and Lunetta Stanley Smith, a 4th generation Floridian. There aren't many. Many would see my years as simple and uneventful, but to me it was exciting and full of events that I now cherish. It was day-to-day survival. I could not grow up fast enough to get off the farm. The 1920s and the 1930s were called the Great Depression, but we didn't know they were called the Great Depression. We were as well off as anyone else. My sister Ruth and I had a hard life, but a good life. We were always close. Everyone should have a sister like mine. And let me say as an anecdote, Ruth did so much editing of me that she was a superb editor. Next paragraph, moonshine, question mark. Yes, it was a part of everyone's life, including mine. I still have a can. It might be this one because he donated it to the museum. A 50-gallon copper still. I made shine and I hauled for others to Tarpon Springs, Brooksville, and Lakeland. I was a small fry compared to some of the big boys like Clarence Lane. I never set less than 40 barrels. I had a souped-up 1954 that would hold 14 5-gallon jugs. I'm lucky that I never had to outrun anyone. One night coming home from Tarpon Springs, after a delivery, I stopped to take out my helper springs. Everybody know what helper springs are? You do? You want to tell them, Ernie, or no? You know, this is the home of the rudiments, so you might want to wonder about the origin of racing here, but
the idea with the helper springs is something that helps hold the car level. You got all this weight in the back, and the car's running set like this. It looks a little funny to the police department in the middle of the night. So the helper springs help it rise level. Now, of course, when you're coming back empty, that same car is riding like this. That also looks a little bit funny in the middle of the night. So you take out the helper springs so it rides back level and you look close to normal.
okay, so I took out the helper springs and a deputy pulled up, wanted to know if I needed help. Something was dragging in my car. I said, no, I'm fine. He drove off. I had 14 empties in the car, 14 empties. He said he was never arrested, he told me. Later on when I was doing the research on Wesley Chapel, I got to sample a little bit of moonshine and even move it around a little bit. My grandfather, let me go on. My grandfather, Daniel Smith, and his dad had cattle and hogs running in the woods. They were loose from San Antonio through this area to the present-day site of the University of South Florida. This was open range. You fenced the animals out of your yard or farm. Cities were fenced in, like I mentioned about Zephyrhills. Sometime later in the 1930s, the state enacted a fever tick eradication. We had to dip cattle and horses. This went on for several years, and it did help eradicate the ticks. The other story I want to share with you to conclude is about an even more famous moonshiner related to Zephyrhills, and that's Stanley Ryles. He was president of the Chamber of Commerce. He was one of the founding members of the Zephyrhills Rotary, and he was a businessman in Zephyrhills for many, many years. When I was researching, his great-granddaughter, Marlo Hilton, pulled out an old VCR tape, and she said, "Do you want to hear his story?" And we listened to it 20 times, Ernie, and I was able to transcribe it. I did have to take a few expletives out, but this is his story, and he tells you a little bit about his life. I was born in 1913 on the property where I now live. My father, Sherrod Ryles, was born on Lake Buddy around Dade City in 1861. I got married in 1935. I met my wife, Bernice, at a square dance. I was quite a square dance caller, and we had square dances every week at the property where my grandson, Bo Hilton, still lives, and that's on Island Boulevard now. They didn't want nobody else to call those dances but me. That would make the girls mad if somebody else called the dances. We walked through the country roads and the woods from Wesley Chapel to Zephyrhills. You couldn't get a car through there. It wasn't fenced back then. And we made about half of the way wading water. My father-in-law burned charcoal for money. I could lay right into the axe and cut them pine trees up at 4-foot lengths. We would go to town with 100 to Zephyrhills with 100 to 150 bags of charcoal and get 3 cents a piece for the charcoal. That's what our whole family lived on. Later, I made money on sweet potatoes. This is somewhat legendary in this area. It was new land and turned out to be a great idea. The Florida average for sweet potatoes at that time was 70 bushels an acre, and I was getting 200 bushels an acre. Marcia's Cafeteria in Tampa sold those dang taters. They'd come by and say, "Got any sweet potatoes?" I'd say, "Yeah, they're pretty good this year." And he'd say, "Give me 50 bushels. For years, we would go from one crop to another. And we had a huge watermelon crop too. After that, he started a cabinet shop in Zephyrhills. But he said before that was the lumber business, and I'll move ahead. We made whiskey. Before that, he made whiskey. Times were hard in Florida, really hard. You couldn't get a job. You had to do something to make a living. And I want to make that clear. It was hard. They made charcoal, they did cash crops, and sometimes they turned to moon shining. We were bootlegging when we were living in my mama's old house where I was born. I was in it for several years, can't remember just how many years. I can tell you when I stopped, however. I came in one night through the woods, and the moon was shining bright, and there was a car, a revenuer's car. I watched for a few minutes. It wasn't going to move. I knew it was the law, and I just went on and told my wife, Bernice, we watched that car all night long. Don't think we slept a lick that night. They were looking for us. We did have sugar and whiskey in the house. Around 2:30, we looked out and the revenuer was gone. You know what? The next morning, we got rid of every damn thing. I said, I'm quitting. Well now I might have used the remainder of the sugar and the rest of it up, but I was done. I tell you, I had me enough of that whiskey. I said the heck with it. I don't want to go to jail. A relative served time for whiskey making, but not me. But you know what? I bought a section of land, that's 640 acres, with my bootlegging money. Thank you very much.